Hey everyone, CoolKid here. Just last week, Warframe released its 43rd title update, Jade Shadow's Constellations. This update brought a slew of new content, with its crown jewel being the new duo of Warframes, Sirius and Orion. These frames occupy one Warframe slot, and are used in parallel similar to Wukong and his clone. The core concept is pretty simple. You have a player-controlled brother and an AI-controlled brother, and the player can swap between them at any time. As such, a big part of Sirius and Orion's gameplay revolves around frequent swapping, taking advantage of cross-kit synergies to maximize the celestial carnage. Or, well, that's the idea, at least, but I feel like the execution kind of falls short. To be clear, I am not saying that Sirius and Orion are bad. These frames are fairly effective when they aren't bugging out, but that doesn't mean that their kits are perfect. To help clarify my critiques, I think it's important to establish that frames can be flawed on a design level, on a power level, or both. For example, Equinox is flawed on a design level, as she fundamentally fails to deliver on her gimmick by punishing switching between forms. She is not bad on a power level though, as she deals insane amounts of damage over a massive area. Sirius and Orion, ironically, find themselves in a similar spot. They are not terribly flawed in terms of power, but I do think they're flawed in terms of design. As a quick disclaimer, I want to make it clear that everything in this video is just my opinion. If you like Sirius and Orion as is, that's great, but I see them as just short of their potential. I'm not claiming that I know better than the developers or anything like that, I just want to share my perspective as a longtime player of the game. I also know that I'm going to receive comments saying that this video is pointless because the update just came out, but that's kinda missing the point. I'm releasing this video now because the update is new, as I want my feedback to be out there during the window where the devs are still making changes. This update has been incredibly buggy, and I worry that the balance side of things will slip through the cracks as the game gets stitched back up. As one final note, this video is not going to focus on the multitude of bugs plaguing Sirius and Orion. I am well aware of them by now, but the point of this video isn't to critique them for being buggy, it's to critique them for how their kit is designed. Alright, with all that out of the way, here's how this is going to work. I'm going to explain how both Sirius and Orion work currently, and then I'll go back over their kits to explain my issues with each ability alongside suggestions on how to improve it. So then, how do Sirius and Orion actually function? The most fundamental thing to understand about the brothers is their multifaceted passive. As mentioned before, both Warframes occupy the field simultaneously, with one being player-controlled and the other being AI-controlled. We'll get to the player-controlled stuff in a bit, but I want to give a quick rundown on how the AI sibling functions. So, the inactive twin will function as an autonomous specter, with several unique considerations. For one, this sibling will be entirely invincible, so they aren't at any risk of dying. They also have their own health, shield, and energy pool, and this plays into the frame's passive. If the player-controlled frame is at 50 energy or less, then they can steal energy from the inactive frame to cast their abilities. The autonomous twin also has access to their full kit, with the exception of their fourth ability. They also have an entirely separate ammo pool from the player, and even more importantly, they do not consume ammo when attacking. This means that you functionally have twice the ammo reserves when playing Sirius and Orion, as you can switch to the other brother for a top-up. I do think it's important to point out that Incarnon Charge is also built independently, so charging a weapon for one brother will not charge it for the other. The AI sibling doesn't consume ammo when attacking, so you don't have to worry about them wasting their reserves. To balance this out though, they deal significantly reduced damage, with it being about 25% from my own testing. I also want to note that the weapon your twin chooses is different from Wukong's clone. If the player has their primary equipped, the Spectre will pull out their secondary, and if the player is using the secondary, the Spectre will use their primary. When in melee range of an enemy, the AI brother will use their melee weapon, unless the player is currently using it. Now, this whole Spectre sibling mechanic breaks constantly, and it's regularly the case that the AI brother doesn't switch weapons, doesn't attack anything, or just starts tweaking out. Again though, this video is about their kit design. I just wanted to mention these bugs because you'll probably see them in the footage. So, if you have a player-controlled frame and an AI-controlled frame, how do you go about switching between the two? Well, this is done by holding an ability instead of tapping it, which will cause the AI-controlled brother to butt in and cast said ability before becoming the active sibling. This does add a slight delay to the ability startup, but it's not too bad. This lets you freely swap between the two frames, and it can also help rein the AI in by forcing them to reposition near you. Sirius and Orion also gain 45% ability efficiency for their next 2 ability casts after swapping, which works as an incentive to swap frequently. One last thing I want to mention about the twins is that they use different mod configs. Sirius and Orion can both be modded separately, and they can even share aura mods with each other. It is worth noting that only one sun can use any given aura, and if you try to stack 2 of the same aura mod, the game will notify you that only one of them will be active. Archon shards placed on one frame will also affect the other, so you don't have to kit them both out. Helminth abilities are a little weird on this frame, as they rely on the primary sun mechanic. Essentially, within Pontus Tower, the player can assign either Orion or Sirius to be the primary sun. This frame will be the frame that the player loads into missions with, and on top of that, only the primary sun can have Helminth abilities infused onto them. It's also worth noting that only the primary sun can use gear items at the moment, but that's a known bug. Alright, with all of that out of the way, let's talk about each of the twins' abilities. I'm going to go from first to fourth ability, talking first about Sirius's ability, and then we'll talk about Orion's corresponding ability. To start, let's look at Sirius's 1, Coronal Ejection. When casting this ability, Sirius expends 15 energy and throws out his heavy scythe. The scythe travels in a straight line, dealing 1500 heat damage in a 5 meter radius with a 100% chance to inflict the heat status. The heat damage and status chance are affected by strength mods, and the radius is affected by range mods. The heat status also puts enemies into the panic state, stunning them for 2 to 4 seconds. The range the scythe travels isn't affected by range stats as far as I can tell, but it seems to go pretty far, like 50 meters at least. Once the scythe reaches the edge of its range, or if it hits a surface, it'll boomerang back to Sirius, hitting enemies in its path again. I want to note that the scythe has infinite body punch through, so it won't be stopped by enemies it hits. This ability has another little trick up its sleeve though. It vacuums pickups. This means that any drops along the path of Coronal Ejection will be scooped up and brought back to Sirius for easy collection. This also means that any pickups near Sirius can be thrown to nearby allies, as they'll still be vacuumed up. This isn't really that useful for the most part, but I do think it's cool. Moving on to Orion's 1, we have Gravitic Slash. This ability also costs 15 energy, and it sees Orion swing his Wrath Scythe in a 67.5 degree arc. Enemies within the base radius of 8 meters will take 2000 slash damage with a 100% status chance, and they'll have their armor and shields reduced by 50%. The swipe also inflicts a short stagger and inflicts some knockback. The damage, status chance, and defense reduction all scale with strength, and the radius of the swipe scales with range. This ability is pretty simple. It comes out fast, deals some damage, and removes enemy defenses. I do want to note that Orion can't currently defense strip overguarded enemies with this ability, but I'm reasonably certain that's a bug. Next up, we have Sirius's 2, Jade Stars. This ability costs 50 energy, and it causes Sirius to spawn 7 motes of light above himself for 35 seconds. When attacking an enemy, 1 mote will be fired into the target, dealing 500 heat damage in a 4 meter radius with a 35% chance to proc heat. Expended motes recharge 1 at a time, at a rate of roughly 1 mote every half second. Do note that basically any damage triggers Jade Stars to launch, so they'll often fire off in quick succession. The heat damage and status chance are affected by strength mods, the explosion radius is affected by range mods, and the duration of the buff is affected by duration mods. It's also important to note that, whenever Sirius casts this ability, Orion is also granted his own batch of Jade Stars. Speaking of Orion, let's talk about his 2, Astral Shell. When activated, 50 energy is expended to shroud Orion in astral energy for 35 seconds. If Orion takes damage while this ability is active, then he will produce a decoy at his position that lasts for 5 seconds. This decoy has a massively raised threat level, causing enemies to prioritize it instead of Orion. After 5 seconds, this decoy explodes, dealing 200 blast damage and inflicting a big stagger over a 5 meter radius. It's also worth noting that this ability has a cooldown of 5 seconds between decoys, which isn't affected by any stats. The duration of the buff and the duration of the decoy are affected by duration mods, the damage of the explosion is affected by strength mods, and the radius of the explosion is affected by range mods. Like Jade Stars, Astral Shell is also given to Sirius whenever Orion casts it. It's also worth noting that all abilities on these frames are recastable, and in the case of Astral Shell, this lets the player bypass the 5-second decoy cooldown. Next up, we have Sirius's 3, Light Sanctuary. On cast, Sirius expends 50 energy to create a well of light for 30 seconds. This well starts at a radius of 5 meters while also granting 15% damage reduction and 25 HP per second. The well then gradually grows over 10 seconds, increasing to 10 meters in radius, going from 15 to 45% DR, and increasing its healing to 55 HP per second. It's also worth noting that, if an ally dies within the radius of Light Sanctuary, they'll be revived over the course of about 5 seconds. This mechanic has a 60-second cooldown, and it can be used to revive both Sirius and Orion if they die within its radius. I want to make it clear that the zone spawned by this ability is stationary, with casts inside of its radius refreshing its duration, and casts outside its radius spawning a fresh zone. In terms of stats, the duration of the spawn zone scales with duration mods, the radius of the zone scales with range mods, and the damage reduction and health per second scale with strength mods. Unlike many similar abilities, the damage reduction caps out at 75% instead of the usual 90%, which is worth pointing out. Moving on to Orion's 3, we have Event Horizon. This ability expends 50 energy and throws out a black hole, which will slowly float around for the next 18 seconds. Enemies within 6 meters of the black hole will be ragdolled and pulled into it, so it serves as a pretty simple grouping tool. It's worth pointing out that the black hole itself is actually a physics object, and it will ricochet off of surfaces it hits. If Event Horizon's duration expires, it's recast, or it gets stuck, then the black hole will detonate, dealing 750 heat damage in a 12-meter radius. On the topic of duration, it's worth noting that Event Horizon has a synergy with both Sirius and Orion's first abilities. Both abilities will add 5 seconds to the black hole's lifespan on hit, and on top of that, each ability can also change its trajectory. Gravitic Slash will send the black hole wherever Orion is looking, and Coronal Ejection will yank the black hole back towards Sirius. The movement of the black hole can also be manipulated by Orion on cast, as it travels forward very quickly if he's moving forward when casting Event Horizon, though it does slow back down after a few seconds. In terms of stats, the black hole's duration and duration bonus on hit scale with duration mods, the damage of the explosion scales with strength mods, and the attraction and explosion radius both scale with range mods. Now that we're on to the fourth ability, it's time to address this thing above the energy bar. Essentially, whenever one of the brothers casts an ability, it will add a star to the constellation. Only 2 stars of the same type can be added in a row, and afterwards, future ability casts will not add a star until an opposite star is added. So, for example, if I cast 2 Orion abilities in a row, I won't be able to add more Orion stars until I cast an ability as Sirius. It's worth noting that only player-controlled casts contribute to the constellation, not AI-controlled ability casts. When casting Celestial Clash, 100 energy will be expended and Sirius and Orion will both raise up into the air. While in this state, the player can freely fly around, and the dodge button will trigger a short-range teleport. Each time the player presses the attack button, the 2 brothers will clash their sides, dealing 10,000 blast damage in a 26-meter radius. Do note that this explosion is affected by line of sight, so it can't hit enemies through walls. That's not the whole story though, as you might have noticed a few things around the aiming reticle. The reticle will show 2 different colors and directions, with the left side being a Sirius clash and the right side being an Orion clash. Matching the clash by pressing the corresponding button increases the clash's critical chance by 50% and critical damage by 1.5 times. Now, it's possible to use this ability with only 1 star in place, but you really should wait until all 7 are active. This is because the critical chance and damage increase stack across each clash, making subsequent clashes more and more powerful. If the player successfully matches all 7 stars with their inputs, then the duo will perform a slower and more damaging final attack. It's important to point out that Sirius and Orion clashes do have one major difference. They use the stats of their corresponding Warframe, regardless of who actually initiated the ability. So if you have high range but low strength on Sirius, then clashes that match Sirius will have high range and low strength. If you have high strength and low range on Orion, then Orion clashes will have high strength and low range, as you'd expect. Speaking of stats, the explosion damage is affected by strength mods, and the explosion radius is affected by range mods. Do note that the crit chance and crit damage increase per hit is not affected by any stats. It's important to point out that no abilities can be cast while in this state, so it's pretty sectioned off from the rest of the gameplay loop. Casting the ability at 1 star isn't really advisable for damage, but it can be very good for mobility, as the dodge is quite fast. The movement speed while floating in this ability is affected by movement speed modifiers, but not sprint speed, and the teleportation is affected by dodge speed and parkour velocity. Okay, now that we've explored how Sirius and Orion work, what's my issue with them? Well, it's a fairly complex ordeal, but it's built on two fundamental problems. All of their abilities are fairly one-note, and they also lack interesting synergy between each frame. To explain what I mean, let me talk about my first critique, their one-note abilities. When looking at each of the siblings' abilities, they all only really do one thing. For example, Coronal Ejection deals damage, sure, but it's not enough to matter at high levels. The main reason you'd use it is to swap forms or to swipe pickups, with the damage being pretty inconsequential. In the same vein, Gravitic Slash is only really useful for removing defenses, as its damage isn't very high and the stun is extremely short. Astral Shell's clone draws enemy fire, but the explosion damage is so bad that it doesn't do much else. Event Horizon's explosion damage suffers from this problem as well, making its grouping its only noteworthy trait. All of these abilities suffer from feeling incredibly one-note, in comparison to other frames where their abilities do multiple things. For example, Pillage is an armor strip like Gravitic Slash, but it also replenishes shields and cleanses status effects. Similarly, Terrify strips armor in a radius around Necros, but it also causes enemies to flee, and when using Creeping Terrify, it slows them too. Theros Strike on Styanax strips enemy defenses, but it also heals Styanax, and both its stun window and knockback are much better than Gravitic Slash. My second critique is that there's little reason to switch between frames outside of building up the ult. Sure, there is some synergy between the two, but it's all fairly shallow. For instance, you can benefit from Light Sanctuary while playing Orion, but that's not really that interesting. Any frame can benefit from standing in Light Sanctuary. There isn't really anything special about Orion being able to as well. The only synergy between them that feels unique and interesting is the push and pull that their ones inflict on Event Horizon, with every other synergy just kind of feeling tangential. For a frame with such a strong concept, I was really hoping they'd feel more intertwined, but they just don't. In my opinion, both of these issues stem from one source: a lack of complexity. Now, whether or not you think this is a bad thing will vary. I'm willing to admit that up front. Playing two different frames is a lot to keep track of, and I acknowledge that it's easier when their abilities are simple. Personally though, if you're gonna go for a concept like this, I think it should be taken all the way. These abilities should do more, and they should have more synergies between the two frames. There's such a cool opportunity for tag team combos and elaborate strategies that's being passed up so the frames can be dumbed down, and I just don't agree with that. I don't want to play two half-baked Warframes that occasionally interact. I want to play two full Warframes who can bounce off of each other to maximize the devastation they inflict. So, with that said, I want to talk about my issues with each of the frame's abilities, and what I would do to improve them. Keep in mind that my proposed changes are built on solving the prior two issues, making abilities less one-note and making swapping more rewarding. So then, we're going to go through each ability in the same order as before. We'll talk about their faults, and then I'll suggest a solution. First up is Sirius and Orion's passive, which I actually think is quite good. I do have one major issue with it though, and that comes from each frame's third ability. You see, the AI-controlled frame can recast either Light Sanctuary or Event Horizon while it's already active, which can steal it from their player-controlled sibling who might be using it. It's really annoying to be playing around an Event Horizon as Sirius only for Orion to recast it without any warning, and it can be a death sentence as Orion if Sirius steals Light Sanctuary. As such, I think that these two abilities should not be castable by the AI sibling so long as they are currently active. This will let player-made setups function more predictably, while still letting the AI do its thing if the player isn't taking advantage of these abilities. Moving on to Coronal Ejection, this ability is close to being good, but its damage just isn't that high. This is going to be a recurring issue throughout this section, but these abilities are positioned in a way that makes their damage a big part of their value, and that damage just isn't good enough to be impactful. For Coronal Ejection, I don't really think its damage needs a buff, but I do want to buff it in another area. Because this ability serves as a magnet for pickups, I'd give it a new effect where enemies hit drop more pickups for a brief time. This could be, say, a 25% increased chance to drop health, ammo, or energy pickups on death if killed within 10 seconds, scaling with strength and duration. This would make the ability much more useful outside of swapping frames, and it would also make it more rewarding to launch the scythe into enemies grouped up by Event Horizon. It would also open up a new avenue of energy management with things like Equilibrium, while reinforcing the pickup vacuum that Coronal Ejection already has. For Gravitic Slash, this ability is already pretty good, but it's still very one-note. As such, I have a small change that I think will go a long way. On hit, this ability will inflict a short but powerful slow. My thought is maybe a base 35% slow that caps at 90%, lasting for a base 5 seconds. This would make Gravitic Slash a better get-off-me tool for Orion, but it would also open up a cool synergy with Sirius. Because many of Sirius's abilities inflict the heat status, the slow from Gravitic Slash could be used to massively prolong the stun from Panic, making it solid crowd control by itself, but incredibly powerful if used with Sirius's abilities. Again, this ability doesn't need a huge buff, but as it's both one note and isolated from Sirius, I thought this would be a cool way to improve it. Moving on to Jade Stars. This ability just sucks ass. Its damage is bad, its low status chance sucks, and it takes a while for the stars to recharge. It seems like this ability is supposed to be used to leverage the grouping of Event Horizon, but in its current state, it's far too weak to do that. To explain what I mean, basically every Warframe with a grouping ability also has a tool in their kit that directly benefits from said grouping ability. Korra's Ensnare benefits her Whipclaw, Nidus's Larva sets up enemies for Virulence, Boban's Vortex is a game changer for Photon Strike, and so on. But Event Horizon doesn't really have anything that benefits from Sirius or Orion's wider kit, aside from just being a grouping ability. As such, I want to adjust Jade Stars to be that reward for grouping, which I'll do with a new mechanic. In addition to its prior effects, Jade Stars will now inflict a small 25% damage vulnerability debuff, which will last for 10 seconds. This may not sound very good at first, but then comes the X factor. This damage vulnerability debuff will be additive with itself. So, if one Jade Star hits an enemy, then it'll take 25% more damage, and then if another Jade Star hits that same enemy, it'll take 50% more damage, and so on. This will definitely need a cap of some kind to avoid it spiraling out of control, which I'd set at 10 stacks of the debuff. Whenever a new stack of this debuff is inflicted, the duration of all existing stacks is refreshed, and if the target is at 10 stacks, the duration will be refreshed without contributing additional damage. The duration of the debuff will scale with duration mods, and the damage vulnerability will scale with strength. So, why do I suggest such a significant change? Well, my goal is to reward grouping by attaching this mechanic to Jade Star's explosion range. Because the range is normally quite small, enemies that are far apart won't be hit by multiple stars, so the damage vulnerability will be relatively low. If they're all grouped up, however, then the damage vulnerability will rapidly cascade, making them much more susceptible to damage. A damage vulnerability debuff would also have huge synergy with the rest of Sirius and Orion's kits, as all of their abilities would deal more damage. Because Orion also gets Jade Stars when it's cast by Sirius, this would add another swap incentive as well. Because the cap for the debuff is at 10 stars, but each brother only gets 7, you can swap to the other sibling to finish topping off the debuff by using their stars. This damage vulnerability will help the killing potential of the stars themselves, but to be honest, I think they just need to be buffed in that department. The base damage should go up to 1000 per hit, and the heat status chance should be a fixed 100%. With all of these buffs combined, I think that Jade Stars will serve a much more defined role in the gameplay loop of Sirius and Orion, and it will have a strong synergy with virtually all of their other abilities. Moving on to Astral Shell, this ability is close to being good, but it's gimped by two things. For one, enemies sometimes don't switch target to the decoy, so Orion will remain under fire. For two, the explosion of the decoy deals a pathetic amount of damage, so it's just not that useful when it detonates. I have two suggestions to remedy this problem, which I'll explain individually. For the lack of retargeting, I think that Orion should briefly become invisible when the decoy is spawned. I don't want the duration to last too long, as it would overshadow Light's Sanctuary if it lasted for an extended time. As such, I'd set the duration to a base 2 or 3 seconds, scaling with duration. This gives Orion a short period of time to relocate, while also allowing enemies to shift their focus to the decoy. This also means that Orion could spec into the invisibility if he wanted to, but that would come with a heavy duration investment. As for the weak explosion, my solution here is pretty simple. Make the damage of the explosion scale with the damage the decoy takes, kind of like Octavia's mallet. This would make the decoy's explosion capable of killing things, and it would also give it a built-in scaling mechanism for higher levels. This damage multiplier would be shown in the ability stats screen, and it would scale with power strength like Mallet's does. Now, this is a bit tenuous, but I also think that the player should be able to attack the decoy to increase its damage, albeit with a reduced conversion rate. This might be too strong, but I'm suggesting it to remedy a potential anti-synergy between Astral Shell and Event Horizon. If enemies are scooped up by Event Horizon, then they can't attack Astral Shell, which would prevent this scaling damage from being used. But CoolKid, I hear you ask, if enemies in Event Horizon can't attack Orion, they can't spawn the decoy in the first place, can they? Well, that's mostly true, but with one exception. Self-Stagger can spawn the decoy too. This would open up a neat combo where Orion could group up enemies with his 3, spawn a decoy with Self-Stagger, send the black hole into his decoy, and then pump it with damage before detonating it. Also, as one last thing, I think it would be really cool if negative status effects were transferred to the decoy upon its generation, and it would inflict these negative status effects on enemies in range of its explosion. This would also extend to knockdowns and self-staggers, so Orion could still generate the clone with them, but he wouldn't actually take the stagger or knockdown in question. This would give the twins a form of status cleanse, which is useful by itself, but I also just thought it sounded really cool. Looking at Light's Sanctuary, I have to acknowledge a harsh truth. This ability is Oberon's Renewal, but worse in almost every way. The heal is slightly better, being 55 HP per second instead of 40, but Oberon's Carpet doubles his healing, so that advantage doesn't even last. On top of that, Light's Sanctuary exists in a very small area, takes time to wind up, and the damage reduction of 75% is very quickly beaten out by Oberon. Oberon's Renewal grants himself 100% more armor at 200% power strength, and allies are granted twice the armor Oberon gained. Do you want to know how much armor it takes for Oberon and his allies to reach 75% damage reduction? 450, which is Oberon Prime's base armor. Even the revive mechanic is worse, as Phoenix Renewal has the same cooldown, but entirely skips the bleed out state, and it can be triggered so long as the ally picked up Renewal from Oberon. So, Light Sanctuary is pretty mediocre, but I don't strictly want to buff it to be more like Oberon. Sure, we should increase its existing stats, but then it's just Renewal in one spot, which isn't really that interesting. I do think this ability deserves some numbers tweaks, but that's not all I want to do with it. So, to make Light Sanctuary stand out, I think it should inflict a debuff on enemies that enter its radius. My idea for this is a status vulnerability debuff, increasing status chance on enemies inside of the radius. This would start at, say, 25%, scaling with the size of the field to a max of 50%, affected by strength. This status chance bonus would also be a final buff after other modifiers. Why do it like this? Well, in addition to it being good for weapons, I want this debuff to also affect both Sirius and Orion's abilities. You know how Astral Shell inflicts blast damage? Well, if the enemy is inside the radius of Light's Sanctuary, it can now inflict a blast proc, making the damage chain out even farther. It would also create a cool gameplay synergy of sending Event Horizon out of the radius of Light's Sanctuary, then using Coronal Ejection to pull those enemies back inside of the zone so that they receive the debuff. This would also buff Coronal Ejection, Jade Stars, Gravitic Slash, and even Celestial Clash, but we'll get to that. Now, I do want to say that this buff might be too strong if Sirius and Orion's other abilities still had their status chance scale with strength. It might be for the best to remove that mechanic and offload it to Light Sanctuary, but as the damage of these abilities is quite low, I don't think it would be the end of the world to keep them as is. Honestly, this would require playtesting to really nail down, which I obviously can't do. Now, while I think the status debuff would distinguish Light Sanctuary without just making it Renewal, I do want to bump up its base numbers a bit. I think the damage reduction cap should be moved from 75% to 90%, as the difference between the two is massive. 75% DR is a 4 times effective health multiplier, while 90% DR is a 10 times effective health multiplier, meaning that 90% DR is actually 2.5 times better than 75%. This buff would make the DR from the ability much more impactful at Steel Path levels, as it currently falls off quite quickly. I'd also bump up the base range from 5 meters to 7.5 meters, making it grow to a maximum size of 15 meters. The current radius is really small, so it's really hard to play around the zone without high range or constant recasting. This change should make it easier to work with, and also more beneficial for teammates as they won't be constantly leaving it. Onto Event Horizon, I actually really like this ability overall. It's pretty visually noisy, sure, but its actual function is very fun. Bouncing the black hole around is a really cool gimmick, but it also presents a problem. There isn't really any reason to actually do it. It's often easier to just recast Event Horizon instead of yanking it around, especially if all the enemies caught in the black hole have died. The explosion damage from Event Horizon is also just terrible, and I think it could be a cool opportunity for damage if it was better. As such, I have a few different suggestions to make this ability more fun to play around. My first suggestion is a simple one. If the black hole is hit by either Gravitic Slash or Coronal Ejection multiple times in a short time span, then its speed will increase. This will make repositioning the black hole much faster, which is important for my second set of changes. So, Event Horizon will now have a new mechanic where it deals a small amount of damage to enemies caught within it. This damage will be pretty low up front, being, say, 500 heat damage per second. This isn't a lot of damage, sure, but things like Jade Stars, Light Sanctuary, and Gravitic Slash should all serve to make it better. Light Sanctuary in particular would make it able to proc heat, and because of Heat's unique consolidation mechanic, it could ramp up damage over long periods of time. That's only half the equation though, as the black hole will now store all health lost by enemies caught inside of it. Now, when the black hole detonates, it will deal its base damage and the sum of all of this lost health as damage. This means that the black hole's lifespan matters much more, as the longer it lives, the more damage it'll absorb, and the more damage it absorbs, the more powerful its explosion. I originally wanted this explosion to be the sum of all damage the black hole dealt to enemies caught within its radius, but that would mean that players would be punished for attacking enemies caught within the black hole. I didn't want it to just straight up absorb damage though, as that would make it too similar to Magnetize, and you'd be able to pump it with damage so fast that keeping it alive wouldn't really matter. As such, I thought up the idea of it being based on lost enemy health, which I think is a solid middle ground. It makes scooping up enemies important, keeping the black hole alive important, and it opens up another avenue for damage. Finally arriving at Celestial Clash, this ability is already fairly strong, but I find it lacking in one major area. No, it's not the line of sight check. I actually don't really mind that, though I get why people are annoyed by it. My bigger issue with this ability is that Sirius and Orion clashes aren't very different, so there's no incentive to build one kind of star over the other. Sure, the clashes do use the stats of the matching frame, but that's not as big of a difference as you'd expect much of the time. As such, I want to add a mechanic that is simple, but would open up a lot more choice. So, Orion and Sirius no longer deal blast damage with Celestial Clash. Instead, Sirius deals heat damage on his clashes with a guaranteed heat proc, and Orion deals slash damage with a guaranteed slash proc. That's not all though, as Sirius clashes will have an expedite mechanic, consuming all slash procs on enemies and dealing them as damage instantly. Likewise, Orion's clashes will expedite heat procs, causing them to deal their damage instantly. This would play into the theme of each brother trying to one-up each other by overriding their siblings' DOT with their own, and it would also make the choice of star lineup much more impactful. Maybe you want to alternate Sirius and Orion for the fastest possible status detonations, or maybe you want to do 2 of each star at a time to stack up the DOTs. This would also open up cool opportunities for builds that don't rely on building up all 7 stars, as these expedite mechanics would still work at low star counts. This way, you could use Orion explosions to instantly deal the damage of heat procs inflicted by Sirius's other abilities, and vice versa. This would extend to weapons too, making heat and slash builds much more interesting on these frames, as this mechanic could be leveraged to make them stronger. Now, I acknowledge that, if this buff were to happen, the damage of the ability would have to go down to compensate. What I'm suggesting here would effectively increase the ability's damage by 300%, which is just too much if you add in my buffs to the rest of the kit. As such, I dropped the base damage down to 5,000 for Sirius clashes and 7,000 for Orion clashes, as all of the other buffs I've suggested would more than make up for this loss. If you're wondering about the damage disparity, heat procs deal 50% of a heat's base damage per tick, but slash procs only deal 35%, so bumping Orion's damage up to 7,000 brings his DOTs in line with Sirius. As one last tweak, I think that the inability to cast abilities in this form is pretty lame. All the other changes I've suggested would open up a whole new dimension to this ability's use, but if you can't cast any of those other abilities during Clash, then it really won't be that useful. As such, I'd change Celestial Clash to allow other abilities to be cast while in flight. This would come with 2 restrictions though. You won't be able to freely change siblings, and ability cast while in Celestial Clash won't build Constellation stars. I think this compromise would make the ability flow much better, and it would also reincorporate the 4 into the twins' wider gameplay loop. Real quick, before we move on from this topic, I want to acknowledge the fact that Celestial Clash is an ability with a line of sight check. The line of sight is pretty finicky on this ability, so a bug fix or 2 is certainly in order, but having to see enemies to kill them isn't a huge crime in my opinion. Blowing up an entire tile set with each clash would remove your teammate's ability to play the game, and it would also make enemies entirely unable to threaten you. At the same time, I've seen many people fairly argue that this ability requires enough setup that it should have its line of sight restrictions removed. I mean, abilities like Equinox's Maim and Uriel's Brimstone don't have LOS restrictions, and they also require setup to function. At a base 26 meters of range though, I think that would be a bit much. I've seen some suggestions to reduce the base range significantly in exchange for the removal of the line of sight check, and I do think that would be a viable buff, but it isn't the one I'd personally pursue. I'd prefer that DE fixes the line of sight check's weirdness and keeps it in place, but I know that opinions will vary. As a potential compromise, it could be interesting to give this ability an inner and outer radius, where the inner radius is smaller but not affected by LOS, and the outer radius is larger but is affected by LOS. All of this isn't directly relevant to the changes I'm proposing, it's just food for thought that I wanted to put out there. Now that we're through all of my suggestions, I want to address some questions you might have. First of all, I want to reiterate that I do not think Sirius and Orion are bad in their current state. Rather, I feel like their individual abilities are kind of undercooked, and they lack an incentive to swap outside of building ult charge. The goal of my changes is to give each ability more utility while also encouraging cross-kit synergy. I enjoy Sirius and Orion as is, and I'm sure many of you do as well, but their concept has so much potential that feels like it isn't being tapped. On to point 2, am I really suggesting a rework level overhaul to a frame that just came out? Yes, I am, and I don't think that's out of the question if you look at the game's history. Both Protea and Gauss received a huge slew of buffs shortly after their release, and Zaku received a full-blown rework in the months following Heart of Deimos. I imagine DE's main focus for the time will be bug fixing, but I don't think the discussion about balance should fall through the cracks, so I'm putting my thoughts out there now while things are still malleable. I also don't really want to wait several years for them to buff this duo through a bunch of augments. Point 3. Wouldn't these changes make Sirius and Orion overpowered? Honestly, yeah, probably, but I don't really think that's an issue. Basically every frame we got last year ranged from really good to clear the zip code, and I think that's fine so long as the frame is interesting. A lot of people frame the conversation around balance as, well, X frame isn't good, but they're fun, as if those are mutually exclusive properties. I think that a frame can be both good and fun, and I don't really know why people act like that can't be the case. The goal of my changes isn't strictly to buff the twins, but rather to provide more options for them to build into and increase the level of interactivity between them. Is that naturally going to result in a buff? Yeah, it will, but if the frame ends up being more fun, then I don't think the power increase is a problem. Point 4. You aren't a game developer, so why are you even bothering with this? Again, yes, I acknowledge that I'm not a designer in any fashion, but I still wanted to get my thoughts out there regarding this frame. The big takeaway I want to leave people with is that Sirius and Orion feel one-dimensional and lack cross-kit synergies, but the specifics on how those things get fixed can vary. If a DE designer somehow saw this and decided to implement totally different changes, that's fine. I just hope that said changes target the same fundamental issues. I also think it's important to remind people that I don't work on Warframe, which should be pretty obvious, but some commenters take videos like this very personally. I can't make any of the changes I'm suggesting. These are all just my opinions backed up by my own rationale. You're welcome to disagree, but if you like Sirius and Orion as is, it's not like I'm gonna take that from you. Alright, that's all I have to say about Sirius and Orion. This video ended up being a lot longer than I expected, but I hope you've learned a thing or two about how these frames work, and I also hope that my arguments for improving them came across as constructive. If you have any thoughts of your own, feel free to voice them in the comments, just please be civil. Beyond that, feel free to like the video if you enjoyed, dislike if you think I'm effectively a Cro-Magnon, and subscribe for more garbage from time to time. I want to give a huge thank you to those of you who made it this far, and I want to give an even bigger thank you to my channel members. This video wouldn't exist without their support, so seriously, it means a lot. With all that said, thank you again for watching, and I'll see you all next time when I transfer Warframe sibling combat lessons into real life.